In the previous lesson, we introduced the subject of liberalism in more detail. This lesson is going to introduce the origins of liberalism in this video. So we're going to examine a number of the historical issues which relate to the origins of liberalism as a political ideology. So we're going to essentially talk about where it comes from. We're going to specifically examine the religious roots of liberalism, because to divorce liberalism from religion just because liberalism was born out of a relatively secularizing period of history known as the Enlightenment is not good history. You have to think about it within context also of the religious roots as well. We'll talk about the concept of liberalism as it developed through the Enlightenment, and then, of course, we're going to think about the influence of the philosopher John Locke, who, of course, is one of the founding fathers of the liberal ideas and is still contributing in terms of his theories to concepts of philosophy to this day. So let's think about the religious roots of liberalism, beginning with the time period in which liberalism was influenced by, essentially. Not necessarily born out of religion, but something that was very heavily influential during the period of the Enlightenment. So even though many put the roots of liberalism, the origins of liberalism, with the writings of people like John Locke during the time period known as the Enlightenment, many would still argue that it was actually the Reformation which laid some of the foundational roots of liberalism. Now, the Reformation was a religious event that takes place over a period of time around the 15th and 16th centuries, and was led by religious protesters such as people like John Calvin or Martin Luther. And essentially, one of the things that comes out of the Reformation is this rejection of a specific denomination of Christianity, the specific denomination being that of Catholicism, and this instead adoption of new Protestant ideas. Now, the new Protestant Christianity argued that individuals were actually seeking community with God, and so there was no need to rely on individual people to actually act as intermediaries within the new Protestant system. So there was no need to rely on the Pope, no need to rely on priests. The idea of communicating with God was something of an individualistic concept, which of course stands in quite stark contrast to that of Catholicism, which does rely on the issuance of priests and popes and various different elements of clergy within Catholic Christianity to act as intermediaries within the relationship between the people and the God. So this is one of the things that is interesting about the origins of liberalism, because we're going to get to human nature in the future when we talk about the way in which liberals view human nature, but they will view human nature in quite a individualistic perspective. We'll talk about things like egotistical individualism, for example. And so the idea of Protestantism and the Reformation and the individualizing of a relationship with God can be seen as some of the earliest of the roots of the more modern thinkings of this new political ideology. One of the other things that takes place in and around this time that is so important for the Reformation, at least, and the development of religious ideas, was the advent of the printing press. So Gutenberg will create will create the printing press, and the advent of the printing press meant that religions were able to be more widely accessible and distributed. Before the printing press, you had people, scribes, who would hand copyright every single thing that would need to be distributed. So you'd have scribes that would handwrite the Bible word for word, copy it word for word. It sounds incredibly boring. They would take many, many months, potentially years to do this, and then they would give this out and make it more accessible. With the printing press, you can do essentially that, but far, far, far quicker and on a much more large mass-scaled production way of production. And so, therefore, it meant that more and more people were able to have access to religion. They were more able to have access to copies of their own copies of the Bible, for example. And so Luther, for example, Martin Luther, a great reformist, Reformation Protestant thinker, argued that this could reform religion and therefore influence this new individualism within the practice of Christianity. And this idea of liberalism is what ties the Reformation, ties Reformation Europe to the ideas of the Enlightenment. So when we go from talking about the Reformation to the Enlightenment, we can think about this through the lens of the development of liberalism. We can think about this as looking at the origins of liberalism, looking at some of the earliest influences in religion, and then thinking about how the Enlightenment is really where we see the instantiation of liberalism. So the Enlightenment period sought to take these individualist ideas from the religious world and then move them into the secular world. So the Enlightenment was a period of great learning, of great arts and cultures, of great intellectual developments, especially within science, for example. And one of the things that is characterized in the Enlightenment period is this move away from religion and a move towards more of a secularization. This is not to say that everyone became atheists, far from it, but it became less of a reliance on religion as the source of all authority and more a reliance on the natural world as a source of authority. So science, for example, as a source of authority. And this is something of a secularization, of course. Now, the Enlightenment, of course, is an intellectual movement which emerged in the mid-17th century, and especially around the time of the English Civil War. And Enlightenment ideas, such as liberalism, would influence some of the most major events in world history, such as the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The Enlightenment was also defined by a belief in reason rather than faith. So it was not just a scientific revolution, but it was also a philosophical revolution. The nature of the origins of authority, of knowledge, and of belief, and of truth was defined less by faith to a particular religious doctrine, but more by reason and logic towards the seeking out of objective truths. Among the radical ideas that emerged from the Enlightenment were that each individual is someone who is free and has individual free will. Thinkers such as John Locke began to question the relationship between, for example, individuals and governments. Hence why we get Enlightenment political philosophy being defined by liberalism. And also, let's think about John Locke in more general terms, because John Locke is usually seen and described as the key founder of liberalism. He wrote his two treatises on government in 1690, should I say, and Locke had a number of key ideas and principles of political philosophy that will still be relevant and important to this day. One of which, of course, is this idea of government by consent. This ties into a rejection of this religious doctrine, the notion that the state is somehow part of God's creation and that the monarchy has the divine right of kings. And so we see a rejection of the idea of the state being part of God's creation. And also, by extension of that, we see Locke rejecting the notion of the concept of the divine right of kings. The point of the true state is the ability to serve the interests of mankind, of the people, with the consent of the people. And this therefore means that people who are governed by the state must consent to its existence. One of the things that we're going to continue to refer back to throughout all of this series looking at political ideas is this idea of the state of nature. Now, it's an idea that was described and taken from an earlier philosopher, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who we'll get to when we look at conservatism. Now, what the state of nature essentially is asking us to imagine is the idea of a society that existed before the state. So a stateless society that existed before the creation of government that we see. Now, Thomas Hobbes believed that the state of nature would be an intolerable situation. It would be nasty, brutish, and short, which of course is the famous quote that you will have drilled into you as somebody who studies political philosophy. However, Locke took a more tolerable view of the state of nature. So we know that Hobbes described it as nasty, brutish, and short. Locke believed that the state of nature was underpinned by something known as the natural law. So there were natural laws, there were natural liberties, and therefore natural rights. And we'll get more on Thomas Hobbes in the future, of course. An alternative to the state of nature was described as the state of law, and it is designed to improve upon the essentially tolerable situation. So John Locke takes quite a positive view of human nature, which we'll get to in the next lesson in more detail. But in doing so, he argues that, okay, well, a state, a society, should I say, without a state, the state of nature, is relatively tolerable owing to the development of social contracts, of natural rights, and all of these different things. But if we then create a state, we create a state of law, we're essentially taking this tolerable situation and we're trying to improve upon it in more detail to create almost a utopian society. For Locke, the state of law could only ever be, and would only ever be legitimate, if and only if it respected these rights and principles and laws that existed within the state of nature, things like natural rights and natural laws. The social contract is what I mentioned earlier on, is part and very, very deeply intertwined with Locke's conceptualization of the ideal state. According to Locke, the ideal state would always reflect the principle of its citizens having voluntarily consented to accept the state's rulings in return for improving their living situation. So the reason why the state exists is because the people accept that the state will exist in return for the state making their life better. And this is known. This is an idea known as the social contract theory, which of course we're going to get to again in more detail in future lessons' time.